We have an interesting subject this morning that goes back to perhaps some memories that some of you have of our old friend, the Reverend Sensaki. Mr. Sensaki, who was part Mongolian and part Japanese, was a very good friend of the society. He helped to classify our Chinese and Japanese religious sutras and so forth. And he had a little place which he formed himself. He was a Zen man, and he created what he called the Mental Garden in San Francisco, the garden of the Zen mind. And that is sort of in line with what we are going to discuss this morning. The idea of a beautiful garden that came into the world with man. We were put here with every advantage conceivable. There was every possibility of a wonderful, beautiful existence in a natural environment divinely created. But we got into trouble, as human beings have a way of doing, and we finally lost our participation in this better kind of life. And to sort of compensate for it, we were given another garden, the garden of the mind. If we could put the mind in order and change it from a tumbling ground for whimsies, we might restore the beauty of our original divine purpose. If the mind is put in order, man, through his mind, can put the world back into order. So the mental garden was to be a place where the human being reconstructed, reformed, and regenerated his own inner life. It was like a garden. It was a plot of mental substance. Now, what happened to that plot depended on the individual. He could forget it and just let it lie deserted. He could neglect it somewhat and turn it over to weeds and plants that had no essential value to him or to us, but even so were valuable to the plan to which they belonged if man did nothing about it. Or he could cultivate it and plant flowers that would please him, or he could plant a group of vegetables and feed his family. There were all kinds of things he could do with a garden, and in the same way, there were many uses he could make of his own garden, the garden of his own mind, the garden in which all kinds of flowers could grow, and also in which weeds could take over. So the idea of the tree of the mind, the wonderful flowering tree, was to become the symbol of man taking dominion over himself. If he had the courage to build this wonderful happiness tree, as he was getting older physically, he could sit under the shade of it and rest and think and have a beautiful environment in his own closing years. Or, as the Buddhists believe, he could take it with him into the other life, and where he was in paradise, his tree was with him, because it was his tree that made that place paradise. And all those that were there who had the happiness tree were able to live gorgeously, beautifully, graciously, while the angels and birds sang to them and the wise teachers instructed them. Because in the Buddhist heaven, there are no lazy people. You do not learn to play instruments you have no talent for. In the world beyond, you go to school again to get the next assignment. But you get it if you have built up the proper mentality, the proper dedications, the proper ideals. You have the wonderful tree of happiness that has been built up in your own nature. Now, some may feel that a person sitting quietly under his own happiness tree would be very selfish, because there are many people who are not sitting under happiness trees, and that perhaps we should never do things like that. Perhaps we should never have happiness in that way. But these people don't realize the facts of life. In the first place, you can't build your own happiness tree until you have served in every possible way the needs of others. The happiness tree is not something you can build by determining to make yourself happy. This tree must come and bear fruit because of the seeds you have planted. And the seeds you have planted are the good thoughts, the good deeds, the understanding and assistance you have shared with other human beings. The seeds of the trees, therefore, are the virtues that you have cultivated in the practical service of humanity. Every kind word plants a seed. Every cross word allows a seed to die. Every beautiful gesture of helpfulness helps the wonderful happiness tree to grow. Where you turn back and refuse to accept the needs of others, then an early frost damages your happiness tree. Everything that is important in the form of compensation for labor is symbolized under the figure of this tree. Every good deed helps it to grow. Every bad deed is a worm in the fruit. Everything that is done unselfishly is a benediction. Anything that is done selfishly reacts ultimately in pain and suffering. So the Buddhist and the Zen man and the Chinese Taoists all have a feeling that we have to make a definite effort to take care of this wonderful inner world, which is a garden of our thoughts and emotions. You can't see it, but it's there. And it manifests itself in the way things happen in the outer life. So that every person has an allotment of potentials. And these potentials are the seeds of his happiness tree. If he does nothing with them, the tree has no life. If he misuses them, the tree is killed. If he neglects them, weeds representing negative thoughts and pernicious habits take over the garden and kill out the good plants. To bring the tree to the flower and the fruit requires dedication to principles. Dedication not to vast, magnificent achievements, any more than when you go out in the garden, you find a great compensation in doing a little weeding. It's just part of making the thing work out. Without care, the garden cannot be kept. Without care, your life cannot be kept. Everything that happens has a meaning, and each person must find ways of making this meaning constructive, useful, and helpful. Now, the happiness tree comes into the life of the person, and today most people are not very happy. There are sorrows, worries, anxieties, all kinds of misunderstandings, violence, anarchy, and conflict and competition. All these things are deeply annoying to the individual. They damage his peace of mind, they intrude upon his personal life, they may destroy his home or alienate his children. Therefore, the average person has a garden that is not in good condition. Perhaps when he started out as a young child with his garden, he planted beautiful flowers there. But in the course of time, he turned his attention to something else, and the flowers were allowed to die out, and the weeds took over. And the weeds in these cases all represent negative conduct. They represent things that are not good, that do not bring happiness, but create habits. And like devil grass, these habits stretch through our mental and emotional atmosphere, destroying most of the peace of mind that we are seeking to strengthen. So we have to start in by realizing that there are two ways of living. One is to control life by integrities, and the other is to let things happen as they will, and the result is a garden that goes to weed. There can be no great achievement without intent. There can be no vast virtue that is not supported by principles. There is no way of compromising with life without loss. We must definitely keep the rules. We may want to do certain things, but do they interfere with the essential purposes of life? So the Zen man, with his happiness tree, tries to visualize a magnificent flowering plant, something that is more glorious than any plant that you can see in this world. In the Buddhist diagrams and in the paintings, these trees are trees of gems and jewels. Their stems are silver and gold, and they have all kinds of singing birds and beautiful creatures in their branches, and they are filled with marvelous sounds and songs and the most glorious perfumes of rare plants. These are the symbols of the life in order. These are the signs of a person who has found internal values. The singing birds may be his own children, but they are there if he has the proper happiness tree. If for one reason or another he hasn't, then the results are not so beneficial. Now we would think, after watching the world around us and history over a period of nearly 10,000 years, that we would begin to realize the facts of life. We would realize that there are values that we have to cultivate if we want them, and that it's very easy to get into trouble, very difficult to get out of it. And the best way is to prevent the trouble in the first place. Otherwise, we devote our lives to regrets and frustrations and negative consequences of conduct. To begin with the general thought, then, of getting a start on this, we will assume that each person is born with these seeds, which are referred to in Buddhism as the seeds in the Buddha fields, where are planted all the virtues and integrities of mankind. In any event, we have within us the seed of happiness. It is a divine right. Every individual has the right to be happy. Sometimes this happiness is more obvious than at others. Some people are happy doing things that would make other persons miserable. But each person who fulfills himself, who does that which is his natural destiny and enjoys doing it, has his happiness tree well rooted. If, however, he starts out with good intentions, his education is adequate, his abilities are moderate and sufficient, but he does nothing to improve himself. He takes the attitude that he will have a job and that he will keep the job, and he will fuss a little and he will fume a little and he will like a little and love occasionally and hate occasionally until death do them part. That is the end which is going to happen. In this there seems to be no sense of personal control. The individual has things happen to him which apparently he can do nothing about. The fact that he set up a perfect cause for them never seems to enter his mind as he faces the dilemma. He therefore comes to the conclusion that he is a victim of circumstances. He doesn't realize that the circumstances are inside of himself. Now, if we want happiness to come in terms of the ordinary commonplace that has been generally accepted, we will have to face the simple fact that happiness, as we generally think of it, has never been successful. The individual says, if I had $1 million, I'd be happy. He has $1 million and he isn't happy. Another individual says, if I can get an executive job and come and be the manager of my company, I'll be happy. He gets the job, and his reward is a nervous breakdown. He is not happy. Another one says, I want a career in theater. If I can get an agent that'll get me $1 million a year, I'll be happy. So that happens, and they get the $1 million a year, and from that time they're in the Weekly Enquirer with their problems to the rest of their lives. All the way along, the individual's ideas of happiness nearly always are gratification of appetites of some kind. Ambition can be an appetite. Fame can be an appetite. Domination can be. the gradual competitive method by which we can gain control of other people's lives may seem to be just wonderful. But these things are all wrong, and the result is they do not end in happiness. And those who have the most of material things are not the happiest. Those in high station are not happy. Those in public life are in constant danger of assassination. All of these goals that we have once thought would fulfill us have proven to be nothing but snares, causes of sorrow and misery. And in the desperate effort to maintain what we think is happiness, we become not only miserable but sick, and finally die in the quest of that which is beyond our reach. Therefore, we have to begin to decide what happiness is. How can we be happy? That means, in one sense of the word, that we must fulfill something. We must in some way become what we ought to be. This doesn't mean that we're all going to be alike, or that we're all going to believe the same things, but each one is going to find the way to make his own happiness tree grow. He would have to use the fertilizer of his choice, but he will still have to decide what he is trying to do, what he really hopes to gain. Well, most of the mystics, including the great teachers of the world, have said that happiness cannot be achieved by direct effort. It is a byproduct. It is the result of other things. Happiness is a reward for something that deserves happiness, earns it, is entitled to it. If we perform a beautiful, gracious deed, we feel good at least for a moment. That's the reward, and that's how happiness gets into the picture. Happiness is the result of usefulness, of the love of beauty, the forgiveness of our enemies, kindness to those in sorrow and need, patience with situations that are difficult. We're not going to be able to fight our way through all these situations, but we can take the statement of the old sage who said, "Suffer it to be so now, this too shall pass away." And the things we do not like will pass away if we don't nurse them. The worlds of better things can open to us if we will let go of the things that make life unpleasant or unfortunate. Now, when most people, I think, in this modern world suffer from a little bit of hypersensitivity. We are so sensitive of what other people do to us that we completely forget what we do to them. Therefore, we are constantly bruised, but we do not realize that we also give bruises. And in the development of our happiness tree, the only way we can get rid of the unhappiness which we feel that others are responsible for is to be very wise and loving and make sure that we are not contributing to the unhappiness of someone else. Now, in the law of karma, it may be that you did an unhappy thing to a person who is gone, that you can never ask forgiveness, at least in this life. And therefore, this must stay forever as a black mark on your record. Not necessarily. The individual can dedicate a good deed to the memory of a bad one, and by making a real service, accomplish what is practically the purpose behind the idea of confessional. Confessional involves penance, and the individual can create or decide upon the proper penance that he should exercise or practice as a consequence of his own conduct. If he knows that he has done something that's unkind, just simply to apologize for it and go on and do it again is nothing. But if we have made a mistake, we have the right to prove we've learned a lesson and outgrow that mistake. And the first degree of penance is not to repeat it. If we find that we have a sharp temper, we can stop it. But we can't stop it by claiming that other people are so impossible we have to get angry at them. This is where the mistake is made. The other person's bad disposition is a blight on his happiness tree. When we become indignant at him and have to return his discourtesies, that's a blight on our happiness tree. And if we want that tree to grow properly, we cannot afford to damage it. And everything that is negative interferes with the karmic consequence which we want, called happiness. Now, happiness has a great many interesting problems involved in it. Happiness is not necessarily having what you want. Perhaps it's really more likely understanding what you have. If you think there should be more, then you can be also grateful that there is as much as there is. Always the happiness problem involves the best adjustment to a situation. An adjustment in which the person is perfectly willing to go as far as necessary, as far as he can go with integrity, to cure a situation that has arisen. One of these classic solutions in the time of the Greeks, of the Pythagoreans, was that every dispute should be solved before sunset. If there was a big fight, the two combatants must sit down before the end of the day and make it up. This was mandatory. No grievance should be taken to bed and slept on. If we do that, then we are really putting an insecticide in the wrong place. We have to be careful about this type of thing. The Indian chief Sitting Bull, who was the medicine chief of the Ugalala Sioux, when two young braves had an argument, he told them to dig a hole. So they dug a hole in the ground. Now he says, shout your hate into the hole. They did so. He said, now cover it up and forget it. So they did so. And because he was the big man and no one could go against it, they had to do what he said. But the best thing to do with a bad scene of some kind is to dig a hole and bury it. Because if you don't, it'll ultimately bury you. So we start in and we say, here is a nice little plant. We want to really love it. It's like one of these bonsai trees. Your mind and your thoughts have to be controlled by discipline. In Japan and even here now, there are exhibitions of the bonsai trees. These miniature trees are things of exquisite beauty, but the perpetuation of them and the perfection of them is a daily task. There are trees that may be only 12 or 15 inches high and look like a magnificent full-grown oak in a little shallow bowl. That tree has been lovingly guarded, protected, watered, the roots cleared and trimmed, everything done to it, daily watching for a period of 300 years. It has come down through a family for generations. Every member that has guarded it has found in it the secret of a discipline. The discipline of protecting that which you have received in good faith, protecting the labors of the past, and preserving the object for the service and glory of the future. So discipline becomes the way of protecting beauty, preserving life, and making possible to pass more joy, love, and thoughtfulness to those who come after us. So we start in and we say, what have we got here now? What does each individual feel, for instance, in his own life as the thing that is most beautiful, most necessary, most worthwhile? Having decided on something, maybe the individual says, I've always wanted to paint a picture, a beautiful picture. This is my dream. Now, having a dream of painting a picture, the individual can go through all kinds of experiences in the selecting of an artistic career. He can study with a successful artist. He can pass on to the integration of his own thoughts. He can gain a certain amount of talent, but then he has to watch out, because ambition is going to sneak in. Also competitiveness and a desire for profit. And little by little, his art is going to be profaned if he is not extremely watchful. He is not going to paint the beautiful things he wanted to paint. He's going to paint strange and eccentric and absurd things because they sell better. And there's the end of art. And a nice little happiness tree dies. The moment there is a misuse, the moment an ulterior motive corrupts the integrities of a desire, the individual is in trouble. I have known at least 2 cases of persons who have made an obligation to themselves. If they ever had $1 million, they would devote it to the works of good. They would help other people. They would take care of the children that didn't have the funds. They would educate young people. When these 2 persons got the $1 million each, not one of them ever spent it on any of the projects he had promised. The money took over. From that time on, he was struggling desperately for a second million and was using it entirely for the fulfillment of his own ambitions. When he had nothing, he was ready to share it. When he had something, he was ready to keep it. And the little tree died again. And so it goes on all kinds of levels of activity. Now, most people are not involved in large enough projects to make it impossible for them to take care of a small backyard kitchen garden. They have always the right in themselves to keep certain beautiful thoughts and ideas. I know people who have a small plot of land, maybe 25 feet square, and they raise all kinds of beautiful flowers on that little piece of land. They never expect to win prizes. They are not out competing for glory. They're not selling the flowers for profit. But they love to work with the earth and to make beautiful things happen. And these people have a physical symbol of a successful happiness tree. They are doing the things that fulfill their own love of beauty, their own protection of life. They become aware more and more of the magnificent problems of growth in nature. They see the wonders of things the average person overlooks, and they develop greater faith in the divine plan simply because of the berry bushes in their own garden. It's all in an attitude. Either this attitude helps the little tree to grow, or it gives it an early frostbite. So wherever you are working with yourself in any way and anxious to gain a little insight, I think it's necessary to realize that religion is not here to make people miserable. Philosophy is not to make people so heavy nobody else likes them. Wisdom is not something that makes you obnoxious to other people. It's what you do with these things that determine whether you are building a healthy garden or whether you have planted something that will never amount to anything when it does develop. So the person who wants a better religion must find a religion which has with it happiness. And this is a problem we are particularly confronted with now. At the present time, we have several first-grade wars, largely over what is it best to believe. What faith do you want to follow? Are you going to do what I believe, or is it going to be my painful duty to eliminate you because you do not? These kind of things do not always come out in major conflicts, but I have noticed a great many people who have what they call deep religious convictions, who simply are not having any happiness out of it. Being right should be the greatest source of happiness in the world. And being right should give us the insight to know how to handle the problems of those around us who do not agree with us. There is no reason why any belief should break in and interrupt the normal flow of human relationships. We have a perfect right to our belief, and they have a right to theirs. Usually there's no problem arise until somebody tries to sell something to somebody else. When I can't be happy with my faith until you accept it, there's a heavy frost in the garden. People are not going to buy this. They're not going to change. Therefore, you cannot be happy, because happiness depended on these other persons doing what you required of them. Off goes happiness, and I know cases where the happiness died for 3 generations over circumstances like this. The individual is not happy even when he believes he has the right religion, because then he begins to worry about the people who have another religion. At the same time, they're worrying about him, but he doesn't know that and doesn't care. So happiness goes to nothing. The same is true in a great many other areas of activity. The person who has artistic skills, it isn't necessary that every musician has to gain top billing for something. Music is a satisfaction of the soul, primarily. A person who is creditable at it has made a very definite contribution to life. Now, a creditable musician is probably one who would not last 5 minutes on a professional stage, but he is making himself happy by being able to do something. And his relatives and friends, if they have happy trees of their own, are glad to let him sit under the shade of them. The point of the matter is that the person has to be happy by doing something, by expressing something, not by arguing, batting and refuting. And in other fields it's the same thing. Stylization, the way people dress, the way people think. These things are always important to others. The eccentric person makes a career of being eccentric, or perhaps even a religion of it. But he does not really have the happiness tree, because his religion is not based upon his love of God and the service of his fellow man, but with content with his own peculiarities. As he does as he pleases, this is freedom. But these free people are in absolute slavery to what they please. So this isn't the answer to happiness. Eccentricity is not an answer. Belligerence is not. Revolution, rebellion, anarchy are not. Even though the principles may be declared to be right, there is no great virtue in nature in doing right the wrong way. And each person has to live with what it does to the inner part of his own life. So we have to begin gradually to follow the Zen idea. So we suddenly come to the realization that taking care of this little tree is not exactly easy. But it is very gratifying, and it fulfills almost immediately great needs in human nature. It gives each person the ability to live with others in a gentle, kindly relationship. So if you want to get into the idea of this Zen Mentorgarten, this garden of the mind, you just look over what you're doing. What kind of books do you read? What kind of people do you have for friends? What kind of educational aspirations do you have? What are your hobbies? What are your pleasures and privileges? How are your attitudes towards your children, your friends? How are your business attitudes to the office in which you work? Are you constantly competing to try to get a higher job away from someone else? All of these things are constantly in the mind, and they are always the cause of sorrow. Now, in the story of the happiness tree, there is the problem of the fruit. Now, almost everybody, when they have a nice fruit tree, whether it's apples or pears or peaches, kind of looks forward to having some fresh fruit someday, and maybe putting up a little preserve against the future. So when we get to the point where there are various forms of fruit forming on the happiness tree, we may decide we'd like to eat them. And then we taste them, and we may have an unhappy surprise. Because of the way we have lived and thought, the fruit is sour, bitter, and not pleasant to taste. That is consequence coming back from cause. If you want good, happy, healthy fruit that makes good jam, we have to put it in there in the form of thoughts, emotions, and actions that have harmonious consequences and will bring happiness to all who are concerned. Now, a lot of people don't worry too much about happiness until they get to the age where they do not have other immediate objectives. While we live in a sphere of ambitions and responsibilities, where our first thoughts must naturally be to families and friends and to the job we have, the future seems a little far away, and we say busy enough so that the problem of happiness doesn't sit directly on us. Perhaps we haven't even gotten time to plant the tree back there yet. Or perhaps we had a good piece of ground and we watered it and put a lawn in, but we intended to put some flowers in someday. And that is the way in our mental and emotional lives things go. But when the time comes and we begin to settle down a little bit and we want a little peace of mind, the Zen monk goes to his bamboo grove, which he has been taking care of for years, and the Taoist monk may go to his happiness tree, which is now in full bloom and very pleasant and covered with delicious fruit, and settle down quietly to enjoy the rewards of a good life. If so, then we find that the happiness tree has its fruits in the form of interests that linger on to make us happy, good relations with other people who do not find us impossible, as in some cases, and with all the joys and happiness of grandchildren who love us, and all kinds of good friends and neighbors, and civic activities and contributions to good causes, and taking a day off to serve the public library. All of these things become pleasures. They add up to happiness, because there are things we're doing we've always wanted to do. There are things that have no particular rewards. We're not working for money. We are working because it gives us an inward joy. It helps us to live always in the shade of our own happiness tree, because the things we are doing are the things we want to do. It isn't a problem of profit, it's a problem of fulfillment. So this is what you can do if you get started right. Now, when you get started, you probably will find either religion or philosophy will have an influence in the decisions that you make. These are the factors which more or less lead people to an attempt to improve their lives. So if you get a religion, be sure you get one that basically is happy. Happy in the sense that the persons involved in it believe in the good in God, believe in the joy of a good life, believe that the things that are proper according to the teachings of the Master are also the things that make us happy here and now. And we find that to be friendly with one another, each to share the problems of one another, these things ultimately have a rich, deep happiness. It may not be so funny at the moment, and it may be a nuisance sometimes to be called away to help someone in trouble when we would rather be doing something else. But if we really have the happiness tree in there, we will say the greatest happiness is to serve this person who needs. And we are happy. We control, direct, and censor what makes us happy, and simply refuse to accept false values in happiness, to take attitudes in which the things that make us happy are not doing us any good. The alcoholic says that a good drink makes him happy. We know this is not true. We know that all forms of negative attitudes, while they bring a certain self-centered satisfaction, contribute nothing to the integrity and happiness of the person. So at any moment we feel like it, we can even find somewhere perhaps a little potted plant that we can have in the house. We don't have to have acreage in order to work this out. What we have to have is intent. One small potted geranium can do it. It has done it for millions of New Yorkers, and I guess it would work here also. But something that is a symbol of life, something that asks us for protection, something that if we neglect it, it fades, and the joy of its own beauty disappears. Something of this nature to become a symbol of thoughtfulness. If the individual is thoughtful enough to take daily care of a pet animal, take daily care of a fish in the bowl, take daily care of a plant in a pot. If this is a service that is recognized as a symptom and symbol of lovingness toward life, it will help. It is part of the process of gradually outgrowing indifferences which arise out of ignorance and self-centeredness. Now, many people can also profitably sit down and look over this ambition matter a little more closely. In most instances, if the individual has reached middle life without the glamorous fulfillments that he has hoped, and he is not obviously going to be a unique person with a destiny beyond imagination, then it is time to represent ourselves as in search of peace, search of realities. After all, peace is one of the great forms of happiness. But an individual who is not properly trained inside can't stand peace. Therefore, he can't attain happiness. He must be constantly irritated or agitated. Otherwise, he's lost, because he has nothing inside himself. He cannot go out and sit under the tree which is shading with its own virtues, which are his own good works. So if we find, as time goes on, that in all probability we're not going to be removed from the labors we have until the right time comes, and we're not going to be able to change destiny as far as the fulfillment of outside worldly conditions may be concerned. Therefore, now we must reorganize our sense of happiness, to begin to look for the things that are the source of real happiness, and find out if we shut any of them off, to find out whether or not in selfishness or indifference or thoughtlessness we have closed our minds to something that could make us very happy, that we have no time for some little things that would make others happy and make our own lives more simple, more direct, more peaceful. Also, the time begins to come in where we should take account of what has happened to us. Most people who are very fretful have simply overlooked many good things that have helped them, and they don't even realize it. I remember the little story of an elderly lady who considered herself accident-prone. When she was 12 years old, she fell in the barn and broke her wrist. When she was 84 years old, she slipped in the barn again and broke the wrist the second time. As he was being set, she said, "That's my life. Nothing but trouble." Only 70 years between the troubles, but they were still very tightly connected. Now, in the same way, when all these problems come along, to look back and see what we have really accomplished in the form of deserving happiness. What have we done that we could really get up and be proud of? What have we done that we know has been of value to others besides ourselves? If we've kept good responsibilities and taken proper care of them, this is a good cause for happiness. Happiness is never from evasion or avoidance. The individual who doesn't want to work and loves to play will find play worse than work because of wrong understanding. But if the individual finds doing good things the greatest vacation in the world, then he will begin to understand life. He will finally come to the conclusion that the world is filled with happiness that no one recognizes, or we have armed ourselves against. We are so afraid that this happiness will be considered sufficient to justify our having a better disposition than we do have. And the reason why we're impossible people is the way the life has treated us. This type of thinking can block everything that is worthwhile. So we find in the Chinese philosophy also that there is somewhere the world beyond, the world of the saints and the sages, this wonderful world of horizon. It's the same spelling as our word horizon, but it's a Chinese title for the world beyond. And the world beyond is a very beautiful place. It is a place where great mountains rise up and beautiful waterfalls break over the rocks below, where there are great meadows and forests of stately trees, and little shrines and tea houses hidden among the rocks. There are little shelters where the scholars and sages live in constant enjoyment, and there are the beautiful jewel trees under which the wise seek peace and happiness. Everything is beautiful, everything is joyful, everything is wonderful in the land which is called Horizon, or the land of the blessed. Now, of course, no one has really been able to discover just the physical location of that particular spot. It is a little like Bacon's New Atlantis. It doesn't seem to fit on the map. And if it ever was, it sank beneath some ocean as a result of man's failure to live or do the things that were necessary. So anyway, in this beautiful land, we have the inner life of the person. Horizon is in every one of us. Horizon is the beautiful world that came to us in the beginning with the divine nature with which we were endowed. Horizon is the inner life changed from a weed patch into a radiant garden. It is the inner world of man's personal life, which no outside situation can injure or destroy. The individual may die for his convictions, but his happiness cannot be lost once he has achieved it within himself. So in this beautiful world of things in our own lives, we come out gradually with certain attitudes which change the psychic chemistry of the individual. Today, psychic chemistries are loaded with hatreds, loaded with conflicts and fears and desperate attitudes towards life and living. The result is that we are, by our own negative thinking, bringing upon us the very things we fear the most. Because if we think negative long enough, the negative things will contagiously distribute themselves throughout society. On the other hand, if within our own lives we do not agree with these terrible negative conclusions, if we believe with the Bible that though there be thousands that fall upon the right hand and thousands upon the left, that the just person cannot be moved, if we know that the happiness in our own hearts is above and beyond anything else, and this happiness is not just plain humor. This is another point. We've got to understand the word happiness the way it was understood by the Chinese. Happiness is actually godliness. It is the individual who has found the joy that is in deity itself. Deity is a symbol of a radiant fulfillment. God is that which cannot have misery, because in itself it is all that is good. And all that is not good is simply maladjustment of circumstances. Happiness, then, is not just fulfilling of appetites. It is the fulfilling of aspirations. It is the individual living as nearly as he can live the life of the divine. This is, however, not reviewed or considered as some form of penance. It is not a going off into some distant monastery for the rest of our lives. The happiness of God is the joy of living itself, the joy of the song of the bird, the joy of the morning and the evening, the sound of the rustle of the woods and wood in the trees. All these things are the happiness of nature. In a strange way, nature is forever smiling and man is forever groaning, simply because he cannot have everything he wants. And yet, actually, if he didn't make his mistake, he would realize that he already has everything that he wants. But he does not know how to use it, he does not know how to claim it, and he does not know what to do with it, so he hurts himself with it every time it comes his way. So the happiness problem is really one of the joy of life itself, a deep fulfillment based upon a perfect faith the faith of a happy child who has not yet become subject to worries. Man has been subject to worries. He can't be a child again. He can no longer be childish. But he can rise above his worries and thereby, in this way, become childlike in the spiritual sense of that term. So where is our happiness tree? It's just to get away from a lot of nagging and fussing and fuming, griefs and beefs that seem to make up our daily lives. Actually, in this land where we live now, most people live better than they ever have before. And in spite of the mistakes that we make, and we make plenty of them, most everyone in the world would like to be here because of the many privileges we have. Now when they get here, they are happy. But the moment they get here and are happy, they spoil it for themselves. Time after time, these people begin to be unhappy because the achievements that they've made are not enough. They are here, they will be able to live here, but then comes the problem, how long will it take to be a millionaire? And right back to the same old problem again. That the fulfillment of ambition is regarded as happiness, when really it is the fulfillment of aspiration. It is not what we have, but what we become that is the clue to happiness that is real. And this is the type of happiness we're still fighting for and not too successful in finding. Now your happiness tree in the Zen function also is a matter more or less of visualization. So in a way we can have a kind of mandala that represents our happiness tree. Now we can have some special thing or some special picture or something of that nature, or else simply have it in the mind. But the mind that we're looking for is a beautiful internal life, a garden, in which all values are beautiful. So we can look out at the valleys and the fields around us and see in them the outer symbol of our own happiness tree. We can see all the flowers in the fields and that realize, whether we know it or not, that there is a flower there of a certain sense, a certain color, a certain shape that is equal to and associated with one of the stars in the sky. There are as many stars in the ground as there are in the sky. Each of these flowers is fulfilling its own destiny. It is useless to say that the yellow ones are prettier than the red ones. They're not. And there are still many that do not have any blossom at all, that are the most perfectly shaped and formed and the most useful of all. So we can't say that they all have to be alike, or of the same size, or of the same sense. Each of these things that grows is a life in itself. And whether we know it or not, each of these things is a medicine for the healing of the nations. Out of the valley and out of the field will come ultimately most of the medications necessary for the solution of all human health problems. These beautiful things are the beautiful necessities of life. They are the source of practically all of the securities that are valuable to us. It never becomes necessary to say, I don't like the blue ones, or to say that I think the tall ones are prettier than the short ones. These are differences which are perfectly proper, because each of these plants is itself a happiness tree. It is doing that which is the fulfillment of itself. Man apparently is the one creature that can go against his own fulfillment. The beautiful flowers and trees are beautiful because they simply fulfill their purpose. They are beautiful because they are happy, probably without knowing what happiness is. But happiness in a strange way is fulfillment. It is being the thing you're supposed to be. It's doing the thing you're supposed to do, and to serve the cause that you're supposed to serve. Luther Burbank made a number of ideas very firmly. He spoke about the training of the human plant, how the children should be taught to recognize the wisdom of nature's laws about growth, about things being forever fulfilling. and that fulfillment in all cases results in the leaf and the twig and the bud and the blossom finally bearing the fruit. For each thing in its own way must carry the seed of its own eternity. So each one of these plants is fulfilling something. And it fulfills because it can't say, I don't like it. Or it can't say, I want to be more like one of the other plants. There is no comparisons in these things in nature. All things are doing what is best for them. And this, if we can get it into our own consciousness, that each one of us has a potential plan, a natural inbuilt reality, which says exactly what will make us happy and help us to fulfill the purpose for which we were intended. Many people probably already sense that such a plan exists, but do not have quite the courage to live by it. They are aware that they are here for some reason, for there is nothing more miserable than a person without a reason for existence. And there is no proof that nature will tolerate anything that has no reason for existence. We are here because there is a reason. And for the individual, the reason is the improvement of self. And the improvement of self must be accompanied by a definite improvement of disposition. The individual cannot grow naturally until he can grow happily. And little by little, many of the problems that we face today could be cured by a different mental approach to life. We know definitely on the levels of psychology of various kinds that disposition is closely related to infirmity. The individual who has a happiness tree and has it in good condition might almost end up a sequoia. He might go on indefinitely. And there are many discussions now that it wouldn't be too much more trouble to get the world into condition where the average length of life would exceed a century. We at least would have a little longer time, perhaps, to be miserable. But nature probably won't let us have that extra time if we can't use it for anything better than misery. We have no reason to be alive if these days that we have are not blessed additions to our purposes for existence. So it would be very easy to imagine that the happiness factor would, as most of the Oriental physicians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Korean, even the Hindu doctors, all make a great emphasis upon mood, upon the attitude of the person. And even in modern medicine, we know that a person with a bad attitude is a bad risk if there's anything seriously wrong with them. The happiness tree would leave the individual mentally, emotionally normal, even if the body had an affliction of some kind. And with the inner life healthy, there is a much greater probability that the outer life will respond to treatment. If the inner life goes bad, then there is very little to support anything that can be done by the physician from the outside. Healing, like all other virtues of life, must begin in the self. It must be something in which we use the faculties that we know as wisely as we can. Now, no one knows everything. No one is perfect in everything. Therefore, the problem of simply taking an attitude and saying this will cure everything simply isn't true. But there has to be some kind of a broad pattern of purpose. And I think the old Asiatic people, with the idea of the tree, did very well. We use the tree a great deal. In the first edition of the King James Bible, 1611, we find the tree or genealogy of Adam takes up an entire page. We find all of the descendants of Adam arising out of a tree that is planted in Noah's Ark. And it is a symbol of the genealogical tree of mankind. Every science has its trees. Trees of mathematics, trees of alphabets, trees of astronomy. It has all kinds of diagrams which take tree form. The tree of heraldry for families, the tree of the elements in science. All these things can be classified and organized in the forms of trees. The reason being that each diffused function arises from a single root. And most of the things we see above ground are branches, but the root is concealed. And this is true also of the great mystery of life itself. We see all kinds of living things doing all kinds of living things, but the root, that is the cause, remains unknown. So out of the unknown comes forth a variety of known things. And out of the unknown mystery of the depths of our own consciousness comes patterns, arrangements, and lawful designs which can be of service to us. The mind is intended to put plans in order. It is presumed that it is going to act as a disciplinarian. Now we train the mind not to do this. We train the mind simply to be a computer for our own convenience. We train the mind never to interfere with our personal feelings, attitudes, or ambitions. We want the mind to help us to do what we want to do, whether it is right or wrong. Buddha was one of the first to point out, therefore, that the mind is the slayer of the real. Not of its natural accord. The mind was perfectly good, a perfectly wonderful, indispensable part of our economy. But by the time we have mistrained it, by the time we have bound it as a slave to our own personal ambitions and appetites, it is an enemy. It is a fallen angel instead of a luminous spirit of light. So each person has to more or less get control of this mental structure and plan something. Plan, if it's only for a few days or a few years, the plan can be made to do something worthwhile. And the first type of thing you have to have, I think, is out of the mind there will come a discipline. But the reason, motive, and cause of the discipline is deeper than the mind. This tree of happiness has a mental stem, stalk, and branches. But the life in that tree is deeper even than that. For the tree lives finally because of the love that flows through it. The root, the invisible root of the tree of life is love. And it is this that flowing through it makes all the rest possible. Therefore, if we can't do anything at the moment in the form of a grand reformation, one of our first jobs can be to recover from all kinds of animosities and antipathies. This doesn't mean we have to fall on anyone's neck, but it does mean that we should have loving relationships in consciousness, that we should be glad when other people succeed, that we should be happy when other people have better days, that we should enjoy the virtues of others and not be jealous of them, and that in all the various emotions of life that we are grateful for life itself, grateful for the people we know, grateful for the world as we know it, and realize that it's up to us to do something with it. If we therefore have at the base of all our relations an unselfish sense of the unity of life, that we are all actually, in the last analysis, each one of us is a little bud on the happiness tree. There is one great tree of humanity. All of the various races, nations, languages, sects, cults, and creeds are on one vast stem. The one is one like Mr. Burbank's famous tree that grew all measures of fruit. He had in Santa Rosa, he had a tree in his front yard on which he had grafted 5 different fruits. So he almost felt that he'd gotten up with the Bible. But in any event, one by one cause or another, we are all one tree, the tree of life. And this tree of life in the Bible goes from the Noah's Ark. Another tree of life in Kirchhoff's Ark of Noah, which is another Latin study of the subject. The tree of life rises out of the heart of Adam. But this tree of humanity makes us all one people. And the problem to try to find out how to make this a reality. Now, we can't make other people agree with us about this. We can't make them all say we think you're wonderful. Many of them will probably say you just haven't sense enough to hate people. This isn't the problem. The real problem is in yourself. Have you conquered these negative attitudes? In yourself, can you say fairly, honestly, and honorably that you are without prejudice? That you recognize all persons according to their merits and not according to any other factor? And that having no animosities and no antagonisms, you can live in harmony with whatever situation arises. This does not necessarily mean that you have to break any social rules or to do something that will bring unpleasant condemnation. The primary purpose in your own heart is to be free from those basic attitudes which can break out into antagonisms without a moment's notice. If within yourself there is a placidity, you also have the best chance for judgment that there is. No one who is in an emotional state can think straight. The old saying was that no parent should punish a child if the parent themselves is mad or angry. Never try to correct a situation with hate. Hate cannot be cured by hate. And hate as an authority generates hate. Therefore, in all of these problems, your problem of your happiness tree puts a quietude upon the dissatisfactions of life. Also, it is an open door to a part of your own internal that you may never have met. For when you are at complete peace with the world, you are also at peace with yourself. And when you are at peace with yourself, the door opens into a larger inner life than we have ever experienced up to the present time. Peace is the road of growth. It is the road that leads to the integrities of life. It is by peace and peace alone that we have the contemplation of realities. It is only in peace that we can relax into the reality of the divine. We cannot take our hatreds to heaven. We cannot take them anywhere except to the hospital or the cemetery. In the meantime, the problem always is that in the happiness tree, we are no longer bound to anything. It doesn't mean we have nothing. You are not happy because you give it away. You are not happy because you keep it. You are only happy because in your own soul and consciousness you know that what you are doing with what you have is best for all concerned. The accomplishment of a non-selfish understanding, which is also disciplined by intelligence and internal judgment. All these factors gradually enable you to like yourself. You can get over the tendency of dissatisfaction with your own nature. You can be sure for once and for all that you are the person you really want to be. And having accomplished this and having recognized this, you can go out in the bamboo grove and sit in peace with all mankind. The Chinese have, as I've mentioned before, the saying that in ancient days, when there were sages in the earth, the wise slept without dreams. Now, a dream, in most cases, is a psychological description of something. Dreams are things that come to those who cannot completely relax, who are not free from internal pressure. The pressure is locked so tightly that you can't do anything with it in the daytime. But when the willpower lets go, then these patterns break through and produce a series of neurotic or abnormal symbols. If you have your happiness tree and you go to sleep under it, you will sleep without dreams. You will wake in a world that is fair and happy, and the shadows of fears and so forth will not be there. The demonology and witchcraft of the Middle Ages was very largely a dream and nightmare phenomena. It was individuals who, in what they thought were trances or in semi-somnambulism, had terrible, horrible experiences. And these poor people were taken out and burned at the stake without ever knowing why, or ever having any understanding of the subject. Actually, all of this witchcraft is simply the fact that you haven't got the roots of your happiness tree. You have not a solid foundation of integrities. If you have, you will not be shaken off by some symbolic circumstance. The temptations that lead most people to misery have no effect upon the person who is wantless, who no longer desires these things, but is happy in the full development of his own internal resources. And the last word, before we get through this human civilization, we're going to come to the inevitable conclusion that we are not all here to be rich. We are not all here to conquer somebody else. We're not all here to vote for this candidate or against that candidate. And we're not all out to make as much as we can out of everything that we do and shoddy our goods to do it. We are here to be happy. And until we are happy, we will use these false satisfactions of appetites. But when we are trying to be happy the wrong way, the world just gets into further difficulties. And if we try to get happy the wrong way, we will ultimately tear down civilization entirely. Happiness is not any of these gratifications. Happiness is a fulfillment. It is the individual being all that he ought to be. That the human being has found the real purpose of existence. And he never knows what the purpose is until he is able to say the real purpose of being here is to get something or to achieve something which I can take with me when I go. Nothing that has to be left behind is worth dishonesty to accumulate. And the only thing that we can store up in heaven is the treasure of our integrities, the treasure of the good things we have done, the happiness we have had, and the happiness we have shared. So if we do these things and do them well, then we will enjoy properly the blessings of being able to sit down quietly under our happiness tree and see the proper proportion and arrangement of the divine purpose. If we do that, we will all be healthier. There will be fewer crimes. There will be fewer narcotic addicts, fewer divorces, and fewer pressures and tensions that arise simply from the fact that the individual has no foundation within himself. He has to have the root of his happiness tree set in his own soul. When he does that and takes care of the tree, he will find that he will have a happy, blessed, and useful life. Well, I guess that's that for the morning. I have to make an announcement at this time. At about 1 o'clock, or shortly afterwards, we're having a little memorial service for Edward Boos, who passed on recently, and it will be here in the auditorium. And because of this memorial service, there will be no discussion group meeting today. We will be down here shortly after 1 to pay tribute to one of our kindly friends who has served us faithfully over many, many years. Thank you for being with us this morning. Like that. Perhaps we should never have happiness in that way. But these people don't realize the facts of life. In the first place, you can't build your own happiness tree until you have served in every possible way the needs of others. The happiness tree is not something you can build by determining to make yourself happy. This tree must come and bear fruit because of the seeds you have planted. And the seeds you have planted are the good thoughts, the good deeds, the understanding and assistance you have shared with other human beings. The seeds of the trees, therefore, are the virtues that you have cultivated in the practical service of humanity. Every kind word plants a seed. Every cross word allows a seed to die. Every beautiful gesture of helpfulness helps the wonderful happiness tree to grow. Where you turn back and refuse to accept the needs of others, then an early frost damages your happiness tree. Everything that is important in the form of compensation for labor is symbolized under the figure of this tree. Every good deed helps it to grow. Every bad deed is a worm in the fruit. Everything that is done unselfishly is a benediction. Anything that is done selfishly reacts ultimately in pain and suffering. the wonderful flowering tree was to become the symbol of man taking dominion over himself. If he had the courage to build this wonderful happiness tree, as he was getting older physically, he could sit under the shade of it and rest and think and have a beautiful environment in his own closing years. Or, as the Buddhists believe, he could take it with him into the other life, and where he was in paradise, his tree was with him, because it was his tree that made that place paradise. And all those that were there who had the happiness tree were able to live gorgeously, beautifully, graciously, while the angels and birds sang to them and the wise teachers instructed them. Because in the Buddhist heaven, there are no lazy people. You do not learn to play instruments you have no talent for. In the world beyond, you go to school again to get the next assignment. But you get it if you have built up the proper mentality, the proper dedications, the proper ideals. You have the wonderful tree of happiness that has been built up in your own nature. Now, some may feel that a person sitting quietly under his own happiness tree would be very selfish, because there are many people who are not sitting under happiness trees, and that perhaps we should never do things like We have an interesting subject this morning that goes back to perhaps some memories that some of you have of our old friend, the Reverend Sensaki. Mr. Sensaki, who was part Mongolian and part Japanese, was a very good friend of the society. He helped to classify our Chinese and Japanese religious sutras and so forth. And he had a little place which he formed himself. He was a Zen man, and he created what he called the Mental Garden in San Francisco, the garden of the Zen mind. And that is sort of in line with what we are going to discuss this morning. The idea of a beautiful garden that came into the world with man. We were put here with every advantage conceivable. There was every possibility of a wonderful, beautiful existence in a natural environment divinely created. But we got into trouble, as human beings have a way of doing, and we finally lost our participation in this better kind of life. And to sort of compensate for it, we were given another garden, the garden of the mind. If we could put the mind in order and change it from a tumbling ground for whimsies, we might restore the beauty of our original divine purpose. If the mind is put in order, man, through his mind, can put the world back into order. So the mental garden was to be a place where the human being reconstructed, reformed, and regenerated his own inner life. It was like a garden. It was a plot of mental substance. Now, what happened to that plot depended on the individual. He could forget it and just let it lie deserted. He could neglect it somewhat and turn it over to weeds and plants that had no essential value to him or to us, but even so were valuable to the plan to which they belonged if man did nothing about it. Or he could cultivate it and plant flowers that would please him, or he could plant a group of vegetables and feed his family. There were all kinds of things he could do with a garden, and in the same way, there were many uses he could make of his own garden, the garden of his own mind, the garden in which all kinds of flowers could grow, and also in which weeds could take over. So the idea of the tree of the mind. So the Buddhist and the Zen man and the Chinese Taoists all have a feeling that we have to make a definite effort to take care of this wonderful inner world, which is a garden of our thoughts and emotions. You can't see it, but it's there. And it manifests itself in the way things happen in the outer life. So that every person has an allotment of potentials. And these potentials are the seeds of his happiness tree. If he does nothing with them, the tree has no life. If he misuses them, the tree is killed. If he neglects them, weeds representing negative thoughts and pernicious habits take over the garden and kill out the good plants. To bring the tree to the flower and the fruit requires dedication to principles. Dedication not to vast, magnificent achievements, any more than when you go out in the garden, you find a great compensation in doing a little weeding. It's just part of making the thing work out. Without care, the garden cannot be kept. Without care, your life cannot be kept. Everything that happens has a meaning, and each person must find ways of making this meaning constructive, useful, and helpful.